What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. Today we are talking about players that I'm scared to draft. Listen, there's a chance that these players have great fantasy seasons, but the fact is that there are some red flags, there's definitely some risk, and for some of them, there's not a lot of upside from their ADP. I also want to say that these are my personal opinions. You can make your own judgments on these players, but I put my money where my mouth is, and you can see my player exposures on Drafters Fantasy Sports reflect the players I'm about to talk about. I'll show you one example right now. I've done 50 drafts on Drafters Fantasy Sports, and I've only drafted Reinhart in 3 of them. If you guys don't know, Drafters Fantasy Sports is a daily fantasy sports app that you can do pick'ems on and best ball drafts as well. What's great about this platform is that unlike Prize Picks and Underdog, Drafters is actually available in Ontario. And guess what, guys? You can use my promo code FIREDUP to give you a 100% match deposit up to $100. That's free bonus money to do pick'ems on the NFL, NHL, and more. And you can also compete in the $11 NHL Best Ball Championship that has $50,000 in prizes. Like I told you guys, I've done 50 of these drafts so far, and let me show you more players that I haven't drafted a ton. Here's one that might get people a little riled up. Faber. I've done 50 drafts like I said, and I've only drafted him in 2 of them. I'll show you one more, a guy that I haven't drafted at all in any of my 50 drafts. That player is Boeser. Don't love his ADP. I think he's going to regress. We obviously have some concerns about his health as well. And yeah, I'm just not a big fan. If you guys have strong convictions on players like I do, you can avoid them in these NHL best ball drafts, and you could potentially win the grand prize of $10,000. All you guys have to do is download the Drafters Fantasy Sports app, sign up using referral code FIREDUP, and use that promo code FIREDUP to get that 100% match deposit, which gives you free bonus money. All you have to do is click NHL and then click the $11 Drafters NHL Best Ball Championship, and you can either join a fast draft or a slow draft. Once it fills up, you'll get a notification on your phone, and then you could start drafting. It's best ball style, guys, so no roster management, no trades, none of that. They automatically put your high-scoring players into these positions, and they are so much fun, guys. I'm trying to do 100 plus drafts, and I've been doing live streams with them as much as I can. There's more info in the comments, guys, but now let's move on to the official players that I'm avoiding in 2024 fantasy hockey. The first player I'm avoiding is Thomas Harley of the Dallas Stars. Listen, I think Harley is a fantastic player, but I'm not a fan of his ADP on a lot of platforms, and I do worry we're going to see some regression. Last year, his shooting percentage was 10.4%, which is very high for a defenseman. No, we don't have a big sample size of his career to determine if that's going to be sustainable, but there's a good chance he doesn't score that many goals. The fact is that unless Heiskanen gets injured, Harley is not going to be on the first unit, and that means that he's probably not going to be fantasy relevant in a lot of leagues. I also want to mention that in the playoffs last year, we may have seen a taste of things to come, with him only having 4 assists in 19 games. Ultimately, I just don't think Harley is good value at his current ADP. Depends on your platform, but on Drafters Fantasy Sports, his ADP is 108, which makes no sense. And on Yahoo, it's a little bit better, 138.6. But I still don't like that. On Yahoo, you have a player like Seth Jones going 14 picks later than Harley, who's going to be on the first line power play and puts up better peripherals as well. So yeah, Harley is not the best value at his current price. In conclusion, I'm expecting regression. I'm not the biggest fan of his ADP, and personally, I'm avoiding him. The next player that I've been avoiding, in fact, I haven't drafted him a single time on Drafters Fantasy Sports, is Jonathan Marchessault of the Nashville Predators. This one is pretty simple, guys. Last season, Marchessault had the highest shooting percentage of his entire career at 15.8%. This was compared to an 11.6% career average, so I'm expecting regression. His 42 goals last year in 82 games was the highest goal pace of his career, and I don't think this is sustainable. I'm also not the biggest fan of his move to Nashville. He is going to be playing on the second line with Tommy Novak and Steven Stamkos, which is okay, but he was on the first line when he was on Vegas, playing with Jack Eichel. I think going from Jack Eichel centering your line to Tommy Novak is a downgrade, so yeah, I'm not a fan. I also want to talk about Marchessault's shot volume. Normally, his shot volume has been very good, and that has given him an advantage in fantasy. The concern that I have is that there's a good chance that the shot volume goes down. He's going to be playing even strength with Stamkos, who loves to shoot the puck. He's going to be also on the power play with Philip Forsberg and Steven Stamkos, who both shoot the puck a ton. And Marchessault is going to be the third option on that power play. So I'm worried that those players are going to take the shot volume away from Marchessault. Ultimately, those are my concerns with Marchessault. I'm also not a big fan of his ADP, especially on a platform like Yahoo, where his ADP is 88.7. With that being said, I'm avoiding Marchessault in my upcoming drafts, and I think you should too. The next player I'm avoiding in my upcoming drafts is Brad Marchand of the Boston Bruins. The fact is that Marchand is 36 years old, coming off of 3 surgeries that he had in the offseason. He had a sports hernia surgery on his groin and his abdominal area, and he also had surgery on his elbow for a torn tendon. We also know that 2 seasons ago, Marchand had double hip surgery, which doesn't have a lot of good outcomes in the NHL. In the 50 drafts I've done on Drafters Fantasy Sports, I haven't drafted him once, and his current ADP on Yahoo is 63.9, which is way too high for my liking. In the end, guys, I'm avoiding him, and I think you should too. The next player I'm avoiding in my upcoming drafts is Brock Faber of the Minnesota Wild. Listen, I know there's a little bit of upside here if Faber is on the first line power play for the whole year, because last season he wasn't, but I have some concerns that he's not going to be on this first unit. The problem I have with Faber is that coming into the NHL, he wasn't touted as some sort of offensive defenseman, and he was only put on the first unit out of necessity. They had two major defenseman injuries. Jared Spurgeon missed most of the season, and Jonas Brodin missed a quarter as well. Because of this, Faber was relied on heavily. He had to play 26 plus minutes a night in some games, and he was also put on the first unit as well. With that being said, this season may be a little bit different. Spurgeon is back. He is going to challenge for that first power play spot. And you also have a distant option in Declan Chisholm. If you guys don't remember, Chisholm was put on the first line power play in March over Faber to reduce Faber's workload, and he looks pretty good on there. The truth is that Faber is amazing defensively. He plays the toughest defensive matchups, and he's on the penalty kill one as well. If I'm the Wild, I don't need to play Faber 25 minutes a night by giving him the first line power play spot, and I can give it to another defenseman who would be much better suited for that role. Ultimately, guys, I can't predict the future. We're going to know in the next couple of days because we're getting news out of camp what the power play lines are looking like. But as of right now, I'm avoiding Faber because there is too much risk. I also want to mention that Faber doesn't put up good peripherals. In a lot of leagues, he's going to be at a massive disadvantage, and combine that with the fact that he might lose the power play one spot, I am avoiding him. The next player I'm avoiding in my upcoming drafts is Morgan Rielly of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, I want to say right off the bat that there's a chance that Rielly is very good in fantasy. He takes a lot of shots, he puts up a lot of hits, and for the last couple of years, he has been on the first line power play, a power play that has been top 5 in the NHL. The problem I have with Rielly is that over the last couple of seasons, we've seen him get consistently taken off this first line power play, and now we have a new head coach. Berube has no allegiance to any player on this team, so he's going to see what works best in camp, and he's going to make a decision based off of that. To make matters even more concerning for Rielly, the Leafs brought in power play specialist Oliver Ekman-Larsson. I understand that Ekman-Larsson is older. He is not the same player as he once was, but he was quarterbacking the Florida Panthers power play for a good amount of the season last year when Montour was injured, and he looked pretty good on there. I also have to mention at the end of the playoffs, when it mattered the most, the Panthers took Montour off that first unit and put Oliver Ekman-Larsson on there. To me, that is pretty telling that Oliver Ekman-Larsson is good on the power play still. And like I said, we have seen Rielly get taken off this first unit in the last couple of years in favor of players like John Klingberg, Timothy Liljegren, Rasmus Sandin, and others. Ultimately, guys, it's tough to make videos before training camp wraps up because we could get news in the next couple of days that Rielly is still on the first unit, and that would be great. Unfortunately, we don't know right now, and if I was drafting today or tomorrow, I don't know if I want to draft him too high. Like I mentioned earlier, I've already drafted 50 teams on Drafters Fantasy Sports, and I have not clicked the draft button on Morgan Rielly once, so that's my opinion, and hopefully it works out for me. The next player that I'm avoiding in drafts may be very controversial, and that player is Jake Sanderson of the Ottawa Senators. Listen, I'll say right off the bat that Sanderson absolutely has upside. His ADP on a lot of platforms isn't that high, so he could be good value, and if he's on the first line power play for the entire year, he has a chance to be really good. The problem that I have is that a lot of people are going to be reaching for Sanderson in your upcoming drafts, and I worry that Chabot's going to be put back on this first unit. The problem that I have with Sanderson is that he plays the toughest defensive matchups in Ottawa. He is their penalty kill one guy. He is their shutdown defenseman, and a lot of teams don't want to run their defenseman 25 plus minutes a night. We've seen what doing this has done to a player like Chabot. It has caused a lot of injuries, and I think Chabot, who is an offensive defenseman, is much better suited to be on this first unit. We also have to mention that Chabot has been dealing with a wrist injury for the last 2 seasons, and he said he got it fixed during the summer, so that may have been contributing to his poor play. Ultimately, Chabot is going to go way later than Sanderson in your upcoming draft, so he's much less risky, and he's a player that puts up better peripherals as well, so he has a safer floor in that regard. Maybe I'll be wrong, guys, and in a couple of days, we see Sanderson quarterbacking that first power play unit in camp, but as of right now, I have not been drafting Sanderson, and I don't think he's going to be worth it where he's probably going to go. The next player I'm avoiding in my upcoming drafts is Gustav Forsling of the Florida Panthers. In previous videos, I talked about Forsling being a breakout candidate because with OEL and Montour gone, they needed to replace somebody on that first line power play. I said in those videos that Forsling was a long shot, but I still included him because the potential was there. Unfortunately, we have seen in camp not the most promising news for Forsling. We saw the Panthers play 2 preseason games on Sunday, splitting up groups, but in the first group, Ekblad was on the first line power play, and in the second group, Adam Boquist was on the first line power play. I want to tell you guys that it's still early in camp, but this is a good indication that it's going to be one of those guys on the first unit. And we know that Forsling is relied on heavily when it comes to defensive matchups and penalty kill as well. So yeah, I think there's a good chance Forsling is not on this first unit. And you could see in terms of his ADP on Yahoo and Drafters, that's way too high. I'm not saying he won't be serviceable in fantasy. He can put up 10 goals, he can put up 40 points, and he puts up good peripherals as well, but I feel like there's a risk drafting Forsling at an ADP of 86.7, and for that reason, I'm avoiding him. You can see that Erik Karlsson, John Carlson, Zach Werenski, Mike Matheson, and Seth Jones all going later than Forsling on Yahoo, and that makes Forsling really bad value. With that being said, guys, maybe things will change in camp, but for now, I'm avoiding Forsling, and I think you should too. The next player that I'm avoiding in my upcoming drafts is Jeff Skinner of the Edmonton Oilers. The fact is that Jeff Skinner is not going to be on the first power play unit, and he's not going to get a lot of even strength ice time as well, so he may average only 15 minutes a night, and for that reason, he's probably not going to be viable in a lot of leagues. Sure, Jeff Skinner is going to have some good weeks in this Oilers offense, but I just feel like you're wasting a pick where you're currently drafting him on a lot of platforms. And if you're looking at Yahoo, I would rather draft Jared McCann, who goes 20 to 30 picks later. I would rather draft Pavel Buchnevich, maybe even Patrick Laine. Some of these other guys that I think are going later and are better value than Skinner, I would rather have. So for that reason, not a big fan of Jeff Skinner for this year. The next player I'm avoiding in my upcoming drafts is Andrei Kuzmenko of the Calgary Flames. I think Kuzmenko's fine in some leagues, but in most leagues, he is at a massive disadvantage because his peripherals are atrocious. He barely shoots the puck, his hits and blocks are trash, and he's no longer on a line with Elias Pettersson. So I just think in most formats, you're just wasting a pick drafting Kuzmenko. The next player I'm avoiding is Matvei Michkov of the Philadelphia Flyers, and let me tell you why. The reason is pretty simple, guys. Although I think this guy's going to be a stud in years to come, he is going to a team where he may not get the most ice time. We have to remember that Tortorella is his coach, and the Flyers like to spread around their offense. So there's a chance that Michkov only averages around 15 minutes of ice time per game. I also want to say that even though I expect Michkov on the first power play unit, and I expect him to improve this Flyers power play, we have to recognize that the Flyers have had the worst power play in every single season in the last 3 years. Ultimately, I just worry about Tortorella being his coach, maybe not liking his defensive game, and not giving him the deployment that we need to see him have in fantasy. So for that reason, I'm not drafting him. The next player I'm avoiding in my upcoming drafts is Shea Theodore of the Vegas Golden Knights. Now listen, I do want to say right off the bat that there is a chance that Theodore is back on this first power play unit, and we saw last year in the first half of the season, he was absolutely incredible on there. The problem that I have is that once Noah Hanifin was traded from the Flames to the Vegas Golden Knights, Hanifin took over the first unit, and he was also on that unit during the playoffs when it mattered the most. We also know that Vegas gave Hanifin a big contract with good term. They have committed to him long term, but they haven't done the same with Shea Theodore. Theodore has not re-signed with Vegas. He's in a contract year, so there's a chance that if they don't foresee Theodore being a part of their future, they may not want to put him on that first unit. There's also a chance that maybe they don't want to put him on the first unit and pump up his value so they can't afford him in the market. I also want to mention that Theodore is made of glass. He has not been able to stay healthy, and I just worry that he's not going to be on the first unit, and he's going to get injured once again. So for that reason, I'm avoiding him in my upcoming drafts. The next guy I'm avoiding in my upcoming drafts is goaltender Jordan Binnington of the St. Louis Blues. Now listen, Binnington was great last year. It was a very big surprise to me that he actually had a good season, but ultimately, I have a big issue with the Blues roster and their defense. On paper, the Blues do not look like a playoff team, so I don't think they're going to win a lot of games, and they have a lot of young defensemen and defensemen that aren't the best defensively, which is not going to help Binnington. In a points league that values volume, maybe Binnington has some value there, but I don't want to have to rely on him week to week. And in a category league, I would not draft this guy. So yeah, not a fan, and his value on a lot of platforms is not that good either. So for that reason, I'm avoiding him. The next player I'm avoiding in drafts is Thatcher Demko of the Vancouver Canucks. The reason I'm avoiding Demko is because we have learned recently that he is dealing with the mysterious muscle injury that no other goalie has dealt with. And Demko told reporters that there is no timeline for his return. So yeah, I'm not drafting him. There's a chance that Demko's dealing with this injury for the entire season. So I just think there's too much risk in drafting him, especially where he may go on certain platforms. So yeah, I'm avoiding him, and I suggest you do it as well. The next player I'm avoiding in my upcoming drafts is Alexander Georgiev of the Colorado Avalanche. I have major concerns about Georgiev heading into the season, so let me tell you why. The first concern I have is that last season he was not good at all. Very bad goals against average, very bad save percentage. And even though he had really good volume, so he was good in points leagues, he was a major bust in category leagues. We've only seen Georgiev have one good season in the NHL, that season being in 22-23, so last year may have been a sign for the upper management of the Avalanche that Georgiev is not their long-term goalie. Another major concern I have is backup goaltender Justus Annunen. Annunen had really good stats in the limited games that he played last season, and just recently, head coach Jared Bednar had some very high praises for the young goalie. Speaking on Annunen, he said, "I got a lot of confidence in this guy. I expect Georgie's workload to be lower if Annunen plays the way I think he can play." These words are not very promising for Georgiev in fantasy, and we also have to recognize that Georgiev is in the last year of his contract. We've seen what the Avalanche have done with their goalies in the past, so there's a good chance that they don't want to resign Georgiev, and they can get a much cheaper alternative option with Annunen. If that's in their long-term plans, there's a good chance they want to give Annunen reps, they want to give him games, and we could see later on in the season Annunen become the number one goalie. With all this being considered, and the fact that his ADP on Yahoo is currently 49.4, this is a very risky pick that I don't want to be drafting. There's already an argument to be made to fade goalies in general, so if I'm going to draft a goalie with high draft capital, Georgiev is not that guy. The next player I'm avoiding in my upcoming drafts is Brock Boeser of the Vancouver Canucks. Now listen, I'll tell you guys that Brock Boeser is in a good situation in fantasy. He's in the top 6. He's on a power play that could be top 10 in the NHL for this upcoming season, and he likes to score goals, so there's a chance that he could be solid for this upcoming year. Unfortunately, I have a lot of issues with Boeser, one of them being his value on certain platforms. On Yahoo, his ADP is 66.1, which is far too high. I am not drafting Boeser close to this ADP, so that's definitely one thing. And then another thing is that his peripherals are really bad as well. Boeser's shot volume is not that good, so he's going to be at a disadvantage. Doesn't put up a lot of hits and blocks either, so don't like that. And we also have to talk about the fact that his shooting percentage last year was 19.6%, which was a career high, compared to a 13.8% career average. There's a good chance we see regression from Boeser in the goal scoring department. And we also know that a lot of Canucks players had a very high shooting percentage. The team had a very high PDO, and I just don't like Boeser at his current value. So for that reason, I'm avoiding him. The next player I've been avoiding in drafts is Steven Stamkos of the Nashville Predators. The main problem I have with Steven Stamkos is pretty obvious. He is going from a team that had the best power play percentage in the NHL last year to the Nashville Predators. Now, yes, I will say that the Preds have some studs on that first unit. They could easily be a top 10 power play in the NHL this season, but Stamkos had 39 power play points last year in the Lightning, and I don't know if he can do that again. The truth is that in the last 2 seasons, Stamkos has been a power play merchant, and he hasn't been that good even strength. Of his 81 points last year in 79 games, 39 of them came from the man advantage, so he almost had more points on the man advantage than he did even strength. We're also seeing in camp that Stamkos is on the second line. They're keeping that O'Reilly, Nyquist, and Forsberg first line together, and Stamkos is on a line centered by Tommy Novak. I'm not saying that Novak is a bad player, but this is not necessarily the most ideal situation to be in for fantasy. I also have some concerns with the fact that Marchessault, Forsberg, and Stamkos are all volume shooters. They're also all righties on the power play as well, and I do worry that they're all going to take shots away from each other, and it's going to hurt Stamkos in fantasy. Ultimately, guys, Stamkos is getting older. He's 34 years old. He's going to a new team with a new system, probably a worse power play, and we might see his shot volume go down as well. So at his current ADP on Yahoo, which is 44.2, I am not drafting him. The next player I'm avoiding in my upcoming drafts is Quinn Hughes. And don't get me wrong, guys, Quinn Hughes is a fantastic player, and he should have a really good season still. But in a lot of leagues, he is massively overrated. Most leagues count peripherals, those peripherals being shots and blocks, but some of them count shots, hits, and blocks. The truth is that Quinn Hughes is not great in these categories, and that puts him at a massive disadvantage. You can see in Underdog Fantasy Sports, which heavily values shots, hits, and blocks, very similar to a category league, which many of you guys are in, or a Banners Points League, that even though Quinn Hughes put up 92 points last year, he wasn't that good. He was 11th in fantasy points per game according to these league settings, behind players like Mackenzie Weegar and Morgan Rielly. Even if you take hits out of the equation and you take a look at Yahoo default points league settings, which doesn't count hits but values shots and blocks, Quinn Hughes was 4th in fantasy points per game. Now, this is pretty good, but the fact is that Quinn Hughes is going as the second defenseman off the board on Yahoo with an ADP of 18.2. The problem is that there is absolutely no upside with Quinn Hughes at this ADP, and there's a good chance that we see regression from last season. Last season, he had an 8.5% shooting percentage compared to a 5.9% career rate. He had a career high 17 goals in 82 games, his previous career high being 8. So yes, there's a good chance that he scores less goals, and he doesn't put up as many points. We also saw him put up a career high shot volume as well with 199 when he normally shoots in the 150 range. So we could see that shot volume go down as well. The problem is if we see Quinn Hughes return to the player that he was in 22-23, which was still a point per game player, you can see that even on Yahoo, which doesn't count hits, in 22-23, he had the 16th most fantasy points per game among defensemen. That's right, guys, 16th. behind Charlie McAvoy, behind Mikhail Sergachev, behind Jacob Chikrin, behind Alex Pietrangelo, and many more players. This was even worse if your league counted hits that season. On Underdog Fantasy Sports, he was the 29th best defenseman in fantasy points per game. This put him behind players like Jeff Petrie, Moritz Seider, Thomas Chabot, Darnell Nurse, Jacob Trouba, and others. Ultimately, guys, it entirely depends on your league settings. On Drafters Fantasy Sports, it doesn't value hits, and shots and blocks are not as heavily valued as some other leagues, so I don't mind Quinn Hughes around this ADP, but most leagues usually heavily value 2 of the 3 peripherals, those peripherals being shots, hits, and blocks. And like I said, Quinn Hughes is at a massive disadvantage in those leagues. But that being said, guys, I would rather draft Bouchard, Yossi, and Dahlin, who are all going later than Hughes on Yahoo. And even some other defensemen like Victor Hedman and Dougie Hamilton are at a much better price than Quinn Hughes. Also, if your league counts hits, you can easily say that I would much rather draft Mackenzie Weegar at an ADP of 84.2 than Quinn Hughes at an ADP of 18.2. In conclusion, guys, know your league settings, watch this video that I posted about a week ago, and do your research on which players are going to be valuable according to your own league. The next player I've been avoiding in my drafts is Sam Reinhart of the Florida Panthers. On Yahoo, his current ADP is 23.7, and I just think this is way too high for a player that is definitely going to see regression going into this season, and a guy that doesn't have the best shot volume either. If you watch my league winner video, I talked about Carter Verhaeghe being much better value because you can get him like 5 or 6 rounds later, and he could produce at the same level. Yes, there's a chance that Reinhart scores 40 goals, maybe puts up 85 plus points, but there's also a chance he goes back to being a 35 goal scorer and an 80 to 85 point player. So at this ADP, I am not a fan. A player like Verhaeghe puts up more shots, plays on the same line with Barkov, plays on the same power play. And you can see with Reinhardt's shooting percentage last year being 24.5%, that we're going to see regression. The next player that I'm avoiding in my upcoming drafts is Alex Ovechkin of the Washington Capitals. As you guys can see at the top here, this is only applicable if your league doesn't count hits, because if your league does count hits, Ovechkin has a massive edge. With that being said, guys, if your league doesn't count hits, I'm just not a big fan of his value on a lot of platforms. You can see that his ADP on Yahoo is 47.2, which is pretty high. Drafters at 60.3, which I don't like either. And the problem with Ovechkin is that he's 39 years old. He's not the same player that he once was. His shot volume has been going down year after year. And I just have concerns that there's some injury risk as well with him being this old. So yeah, if he fell in drafts, sure, like there's a chance he puts up 35 goals. I would take him in my later rounds, but at his current ADP, I'm avoiding him. The last player I want to talk about is somebody that I'm not necessarily avoiding in my upcoming drafts, but it's definitely a player that I'm conflicted about. This player is Artemi Panarin of the New York Rangers, and let me tell you why he may be a risky pick. The reason that he could be risky is because notoriously, this guy has not scored a lot of goals, and he's not put up a lot of shots either. In 22-23, he pays for 204 shots. In 21-22, he pays for 193 shots. And in 2020-2021, he pays for 206 shots. This is really bad shot volume, and this coupled with the fact that he doesn't put up a lot of hits and blocks, in prior seasons, he has been massively overrated. The thing is, though, this changed last season. He decided to start shooting the puck, and you can see that last year he put up 303 shots in 82 games. His previous career high was 228 shots, so this was a massive increase, and we saw that he scored 49 goals in this season, which was the highest goal pace of his entire career. Prior to the season, Panarin's highest goal pace was 38, and that was the only time that he paced for 35 plus goals in a year. This is ultimately why I'm conflicted. Panarin is 32 years old, and there's a chance that he returns to being a player that doesn't score a lot of goals and doesn't put up a lot of shots either. Now, even though I say this, the reason I'm not totally out on Panarin is because he's in a very good situation. The Rangers have one of the best power plays in the league, and that even strength line of Trocheck, Panarin, and Lafreniere was one of the best lines in the NHL last season. This is arguably the best line Panarin has had in his career, and they're going to keep this line together, so he should still be really good in fantasy. In the end, guys, there's arguments to both sides, but his current ADP is 10.5 on Yahoo, and he may be one of the riskier first-round picks out of all these other guys, so that's definitely a reason I'm conflicted. We'll see what happens, guys, but in my opinion, I would rather draft Jack Hughes over Panarin. You know you're getting that shot volume with Hughes. You know you're getting that goal potential. And with Panarin, there's some risk. We see some regression in both of those departments. So, yeah, that's my reasoning. I'm conflicted, and I'm not drafting him in a lot of my drafts. The last thing I want to talk about is early training camp negatives. I already talked about Forsling and Demko earlier, but what I'll say is Dylan Cousins, not on the first-line power play in the preseason game that we saw. Definitely concerning. Talked about him as a sleeper. He is no longer a sleeper, if that's the case, guys. Jack Quinn is on the first unit, so don't draft Cousins, draft Quinn. Another thing I don't like is William Nylander moving to center. There's a chance that this experiment fails, but adjusting to a new position could be an issue for him in fantasy. And we can also see that Berube is running 3 lines. So spreading out that offense, having players not necessarily playing with elite guys is not ideal for fantasy. With that being said, they currently have Tavares on the 3rd line, which I don't love. I like Tavares because he takes a lot of shots, he puts up a lot of hits, and he's still on the first line power play, but this is definitely going to cap his upside. The last player I want to mention on here is Pavel Buchnevich. In training camp, they have moved him to center, so he's centering the 2nd line, not on a line with Kyrou and Thomas, and that's bad for a number of reasons. The obvious reason is that moving to a new position can cause issues for a player. They may not be as consistent. There could be some growing pains. The second reason I don't like it is because if he's a center, he's not going to be playing with Kyrou and Thomas. He's going to be playing on the 2nd line with Braden Shen and Jake Neighbors. I'm not saying Shen and Neighbors are bad players, but you want Buchnevich to be playing with Kyrou and Thomas, and if he's not, his ceiling's going to be massively capped. Ultimately, guys, I talked about Buchnevich in my sleeper video. He's still good value, I think, on a lot of platforms, but I'm definitely less bullish on Buchnevich if he's not playing with Thomas and Kyrou, even strength. One thing I want to edit in here is that Byfield is currently practicing on the 2nd power play unit in camp, which obviously tanks his value. It's still very early, guys, but I think the reason they're doing this is because they don't want so many lefties on the first unit, and that's why they have Lafreniere on that first unit. We'll see what happens, guys, but this is definitely not good for Byfield's value, so you may want to avoid him in your upcoming drafts. All right, now I want to give you guys some early training camp positives. I'll be making a video dedicated to training camp very soon, but I wanted to give you the most up-to-date information to help you with your drafts. We're going to get a lot of news in the next coming days, but in terms of the news that we've got so far, we see Mikhail Sergachev is on the first line power play, which is really good for his value. We also see Barrett Hayden, who is playing line 1 and on the first line power play as well. Hayden only has center eligibility, so I'm not advocating for you to draft him, but in a deeper league like 16 teams or more, he could be really good value. Another thing that we saw, like I mentioned with the Forsling section, is that we saw Ekblad on the first power play unit in their first preseason game, and then in the other group, Boquist is on that first unit. So there's a good chance that one of these guys is on the first unit, and that is obviously going to help their value. We did also see Nate Schmidt on the first unit with Ekblad, so he's a distant option as well. So yeah, these guys all have potential. We don't know what's going to happen just yet, but it is good. The other players that have gained value during training camp are Artemi Panarin, who is dealing with an injury, but with Demko out, he could potentially be the #1 goalie. And then we also saw Kevin Lankinen get signed by the Canucks, obviously as an insurance policy. And if we have Demko and Silvas injured, then Lankinen could be the #1 goalie on a pretty good team. Other players we have to mention here, Jack Quinn. He is on the first line power play on the Sabres currently. They did that in preseason, in the preseason game that they played in. So this would obviously be massive for his value. It's still very early, so nothing is confirmed, but I would much rather draft Jack Quinn than Dylan Cousins. Other players here include Shane Gostisbehere, who's on the first power play unit. I expected this, but we got confirmation of this, so very good for his value. We also have Brandon Hagel on the first power play unit. We saw that in camp. It's very early. There's a good chance Nicholas Paul gets back on this first unit because they need to have a big body screening the goalie, in my opinion. But obviously, if Hagel is on the first unit, his value goes up quite a bit. The last player I want to mention here is Alex Lafreniere. Like I mentioned with Byfield, they have Byfield on the second power play unit, and they have Lafreniere on the first unit. So if this sticks, then this guy gains a ton of value. I also want to say, guys, if you want up-to-date information on training camp, follow my X/Twitter at FIREDUP Fantasy. I'm going to be posting tweets daily on there, giving you guys updates on power play lines, injuries, even strength lines, etc. So it would be really useful to follow me and get that info. I also want to mention that Matt Boldy suffered an injury. He is currently out week to week, but they said they expect him to be ready for the opener. So not the worst news in the world, but he might be a little bit slow to start the year. All right, guys, that is the end of the video. Subscribe if you're new to the channel. Hit that like button if you enjoyed it, and I will catch you in the next one.